we think about how media impacts women, almost all of pop culture pops into our heads. From all of these bikini models to music videos and, of course, Instagram itself. And rightfully so. The objectification and sexualization of women in the media is a very real and important issue. However, today I want to talk about something that's a little more overlooked, the concept of hypermasculinity. Just like women, unrealistic expectations and gender roles are also placed on men. However, since they're not viewed as a traditionally oppressed group, this issue doesn't receive nearly as much attention as, say, other more feminism issues. For example, a Google search of the media's effect on women produces almost twice as many results as a Google search of the media's effect on men. In a TEDx talk by Chimamanda Adichie, she talks about the danger of only having a single story, the danger of a single point of view. And in the same way, this story has two victims, both men and women. A term that's come up quite frequently in the last year and in the last election cycle specifically is that of locker room talk. This is the idea that men are naturally inclined to sexualize and objectify women. Granted, humans are inherently sexual. However, when boys are taught that their self-worth comes from their ability to be sexually successful, this creates a culture of inherent sexualization. I'm sure you've heard conversations, especially with people more into their 20s, about how many girls you can pick up or how many have you slept with. And this creates the idea that sexuality has become a tool for status, power, and respect. Masculinity no longer depends on a man's ability to work hard or on his character, but on his ability to be sexually successful. When I was a freshman coming into high school, I had a certain conversation with one of my friends that led me to this entire idea of hypermasculinity. He told me that boys don't really talk about their feelings. And to my 14-year-old self, I was in shock for a second. After all, as a teenage girl, all I really did was talk about my feelings. I would talk about how I felt, how my friends felt, how we really felt about each other, and it was just a completely normal conversation to have. Albeit I was naive, and likely still am, and this is, of course, a highly generalizing statement. There are plenty of more closed-off females and open males, and it's not something that can apply to everyone. However, all stereotypes do bear some semblance of the truth. Looking back to elementary school and middle school, I could tell that this was true. Boys that were more open about their feelings would often be called negative names such as crybabies and generally more looked down upon. And even in my own family of 3 brothers and me, I could tell that this was true. Throughout high school, I would often cry openly from stress or other various issues, and most of the time, my parents would just comfort me and tell me that it was all going to be okay. However, when one of my brothers cried about their stress or school, my dad would always refer to this one phrase: be a man. This was the concept that you should just grow up and be a man, or try harder, be a man. Stop crying, you're a man. It's a pretty common phrase we hear growing up. And it may come from a place of encouragement and discipline. However, the problem lies when boys get the impression that their masculinity comes from their ability to remain strong at all times. This is an idea that shames vulnerability and showing any weak emotions. Weak emotions in this case include fear, sadness, any kind of embarrassment, depression, and in general things that shouldn't be expressed. Instead of expressing them in healthy ways through conversations or talking to other people, they tend to be channeled in much more negative fashion, such as violence, aggression, and lashing out at other people. Even growing up, boys tend to lash out and get in fights more often than girls do because it's the only socially acceptable way to express these more negative emotions. Thomas Sheff proposes an interesting idea in his paper, Hypermasculinity and Violence as a Social System. Social isolation is something that comes from the suppression of vulnerability, eventually leads to an inability to interact and form human connections. Vulnerability is a building foundation to form human connections, to genuinely share your feelings and ideas with other people. And an inability to do that will lead to social isolation and withdrawal. Social isolation and withdrawal are also two major trends that connect mass shootings and school shooters. Of course, this is a very extreme consequence of hypermasculinity, but a very important one to talk about. For example, at a recent Minnesota high school shooting, the shooter left behind a series of writings. And one of the excerpts said, "I have friends, but I'm basically a loner in a group of loners. I've never really talked to anyone about my past or the problems I have in my life." Granted, there are many other factors that go into the mentality of a school shooter. This can involve bullying and the tremendous negligence of the mental health care system. However, I do believe that social isolation and withdrawal are also two major factors. For example, there hasn't been a single female school shooter in recent history. Men are much more susceptible to having a lack of secure bonds because of the suppression of vulnerability and hypermasculinity. Of course, there's equal blame to go around on both sides. There isn't one group that is at fault for hypermasculinity, and there isn't one group that is exempt from its consequences. Men may expect women to be submissive, but women also perpetrate a harmful stereotype when they want a silent, strong protector. A man who doesn't talk about his feelings, any sign of fear, worry, or anxiousness. This issue is interrelated with many other important social issues of our time. That can include depression and suicide, domestic abuse, and of course, mass shootings. However, if we really want to find the solutions to all of these problems, we must first realize that hypermasculinity is a root cause. Thank you.